You stand in the atrium of the Palatine Palace, marble cold beneath your feet, torchlight casting long shadows across frescoed walls. The year is 48 CE. Through the doorway, you glimpse her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, silk that costs more than a legionnaire's yearly wage clinging to her frame. She laughs at something a senator whispers. Her husband, the Emperor Claudius, sits 20 paces away, reviewing grain reports, oblivious, or pretending to be. In 6 hours, she will leave through the servants' entrance, disguise herself, and walk into the Subura district, where Rome's brothels operate in permanent twilight. She will take the name Lysiska. She will work until dawn, and when aristocratic men recognize the Empress of Rome selling her body for copper coins, she will smile because their silence has just become her property. Before we descend further into the labyrinth of power and transgression that defined Messalina's reign, take a moment to subscribe and share where in the world you're watching from. It's extraordinary how curiosity about humanity's darkest chapters connects us across continents and centuries, turning individual fascination into a global conversation about the patterns that shaped us. The woman history would remember as Rome's most sexually transgressive empress began as the empire's symbol of renewal. But here's the paradox that ancient sources couldn't reconcile. Was Valeria Messalina a monster who weaponized depravity, or was she the inevitable product of a system that gave unlimited power to a child bride while demanding she remain powerless? The answer matters because it reveals something uncomfortable about empire itself, how societies build cages of virtue around women, then call them deviant when those cages crack open. The Mediterranean world of the mid-1st century CE operated on a fiction of female propriety. While emperors kept male and female concubines, while senators visited lupanars staffed by enslaved women and children, while generals raped their way across conquered territories, aristocratic wives were expected to embody pudicitia, a virtue that meant chastity, modesty, and silent obedience. The entire social structure depended on this performance. Patrician women were not people. They were vessels for legitimate heirs, living symbols of family honor. Their bodies belonged to fathers, then husbands, then sons. Their desires, if they had any, were irrelevant. When Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known as Caligula, was assassinated in January of 41 CE, Rome teetered on the edge of civil war. 4 years of theatrical cruelty had traumatized the Senate. Caligula had forced senators to watch while he violated their wives at state dinners, appointed his horse Incitatus to the consulship as mockery, and executed men for failing to laugh at his jokes. The Praetorian Guard found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain, stammering in terror, and proclaimed him emperor not because he was qualified, but because the empire needed someone wearing the purple before the legions started choosing sides. Claudius understood he was a compromise candidate. At 50, with a pronounced limp and a speech impediment that caused aristocrats to mock him openly, he had survived decades of imperial politics by appearing harmless. Now he needed legitimacy, fast heirs, dynasty, proof that the gods still favored Rome. The solution arrived in the form of Valeria Messalina, his third cousin, barely 15 years old. Her bloodline traced directly to Marcus Valerius Messala Corvinus, one of Augustus's most trusted generals. Poets described her beauty in terms usually reserved for Venus' pale skin that had never seen labor, golden hair arranged in the modest styles respectable matrons wore, features so symmetrical they seemed sculpted. The Senate approved the marriage unanimously. Rome's traumatized elite needed to believe that virtue could be restored, that the chaos of Caligula's reign was an aberration rather than a revelation. The wedding ceremony took place in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill with full religious ritual. Messalina wore the traditional flame-colored veil and carried a spindle and distaff symbols of domestic virtue. When she spoke her vows, her voice was barely audible, exactly as custom demanded. She was being transformed from girl to matrona, from individual to institution. Every gesture, every glance, every word she would speak for the rest of her life would be interpreted as a reflection of imperial virtue. She was 15 years old, married to a man more than 3 times her age, and the entire empire was watching her for signs of the purity they desperately needed to believe in. Within 18 months, she gave Claudius exactly what Rome required. First a daughter, Claudia Octavia, then a son, Britannicus, named for his father's conquest of Britain. The succession was secure. Official inscriptions praised her as the embodiment of traditional feminine virtue. Coins were minted showing her with modest veiled head. At state functions she appeared beside Claudius, silent and serene, the perfect symbol of domestic stability. The Senate breathed easier. The empire had heirs. The bloodline was secure. Everything that mattered to Roman continuity was in place. But between the public ceremonies and private chambers, something else was taking shape, a second life that operated in the spaces where official Rome refused to look. The evidence comes from multiple ancient sources. Tacitus, writing under Trajan with access to imperial archives. Suetonius, who served as Hadrian's secretary with access to the Palatine libraries. Cassius Dio, working from now-lost contemporary accounts. And Pliny the Elder, whose encyclopedic work included a detail so shocking that scribes would argue for centuries about whether to preserve it. These men wrote decades after Messalina's death. All carried political biases, and all had reasons to portray powerful women as sexual threats. But the consistency of certain details across hostile sources suggests a core of events that actually occurred, even if the interpretation was shaped by misogyny. The first whispers emerged around 43 CE, a year after Britannicus's birth. A senator named Gaius Silius, young, ambitious, married to a respectable patrician woman, was seen leaving the Palatine palace at unusual hours. Then came reports of other men, actors from the theater, gladiators who should have been confined to their barracks, freedmen who suddenly acquired wealth they couldn't explain. The palace household grew larger, its functions more opaque. Claudius, absorbed in administrative reforms and the planning of Britain's invasion, either didn't notice or chose not to. His freedmen secretaries Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus managed the daily operations of empire while the emperor drafted legal reforms and oversaw engineering projects. He was, by most accounts, an effective administrator trapped in an impossible personal situation. The system Messalina constructed was more sophisticated than simple adultery. She wasn't collecting lovers. She was building a network of complicity and control that would make her untouchable. The mechanism operated on a principle that would be familiar to any intelligence agency. Everyone who participated became an asset, and everyone who witnessed became compromised. Refusal was not merely punished. It was made unthinkable. The architecture of the Palatine Palace itself enabled this parallel court. Built over generations by successive emperors, the complex was a labyrinth of staterooms, private apartments, servants' quarters, libraries, temples, and gardens sprawling across the hill. Multiple entrances and exits, corridors that connected in unexpected ways, rooms whose official functions masked other uses. Messalina's apartments occupied the northeastern section, with access to both the formal reception halls and a less-watched gate that opened onto the Clivus Palatinus. From there it was a short walk to the Subura. The Subura district pressed against the base of the Palatine like a shadow. While senators conducted business in the Forum Romanum nearby, The Subura operated under different rules, narrow streets that never saw direct sunlight, ensilays stacked 5 and 6 stories high, taverns that never closed, and lupanars where prostitution was legal, regulated, and taxed. The brothels ranged from upscale establishments with interior gardens to stone cells with straw pallets, but all shared the same basic structure. A front room where customers selected from displayed options, private rooms in the back, and a discreet accounting system. The women who worked there were enslaved, freed women trapped by debt, or occasionally freeborn citizens who had run out of alternatives. They wore distinctive togas, the toga malabris, that marked them as sexually available, and were registered with the aediles who collected taxes. Tacitus provides the detail that would define Messalina's legacy. She adopted the professional name Lysiska and became a regular at a brothel managed by a woman named Scylla. Not once, not as youthful indiscretion, but habitually. She would leave the palace after dark, disguised with a dark wig and the heavy cosmetics that marked professional sex workers' kohl smudged around her eyes, cheap perfume covering the expensive scents that might betray her. She would work in the brothel until dawn, then return to the palace, remove the disguise, and attend morning sacrifices to Vesta, goddess of chastity and the hearth. The psychology of this behavior is more complex than simple sexual appetite. Messalina was arguably the second most powerful person in the Roman Empire. She could summon anyone to her bed with complete immunity. She didn't need to visit brothels for access to sex. What she gained was something else entirely. The experience of choosing, of anonymity, of momentarily escaping the performance of imperial virtue. And more darkly, the power of knowing that every client who recognized her, and many, must have become someone she owned. Because what could they do? Report the Empress to whom? The Emperor who would have to admit his own humiliation? The Praetorian Guard who served at imperial pleasure. Every recognition was a transaction. The man gained a secret that proved he'd been in a brothel. She gained leverage that ensured his silence. And if he was a senator or a military officer, or anyone with something to lose, that leverage became part of a network of complicity that made her position increasingly unassailable. She wasn't just transgressing Roman sexual norms. She was weaponizing them. The same society that created such rigid categories of sexual virtue and vice had given her a tool to control the men who enforced those categories. But the brothel visits were almost training exercises compared to what happened inside the palace. Messalina began hosting banquets that started as conventional aristocratic gatherings, senators and their wives, reclining on couches around low tables, discussing politics and literature over multiple courses served by well-trained household slaves. Then, at some point in the evening, the doors would close and new guests would arrive. Gladiators still carrying the smell of the arena, actors from the theatrical troupes that performed at public festivals, sometimes groups of young men from patrician families who had been summoned under the pretense that Messalina wished to discuss their fathers' careers. What happened next is described with remarkable consistency across sources that otherwise disagree on many details. The banquets transformed into what Tacitus calls spectacular displays, but the audience and performers kept shifting roles. Senators were ordered to perform sexually with partners chosen by Messalina, often men they'd prosecuted in court or political rivals they'd publicly opposed. Aristocratic women married, respectable matronae were commanded to play the role of prostitutes, while their husbands watched, forbidden to intervene. Young men from prominent families discovered that their invitations weren't about career advancement. The brilliance of the system was its totality. Participation didn't just compromise you. It made you complicit in everyone else's compromise. Once you'd performed at Messalina's command, you had overwhelming incentive to ensure others did the same. because your survival depended on mutual assured destruction. If one person broke silence, if one senator went public, the entire network would collapse and everyone would be exposed. So instead, they stayed silent, attended the next banquet, participated again, and sank deeper into complicity. Refusal carried swift consequences. A tribune named Gnaeus Sentius Saturninus declined an invitation to one of Messalina's gatherings. Within 3 days, his body was discovered in the Tiber. Official cause of death: suicide. A senator named Decius Calpurnianus attempted to leave Rome without permission, claiming family business required his presence in his home province. His assets were seized for alleged corruption before he reached the city gates. The examples accumulated. Everyone understood the message. The Empress did not accept no. Then came the contest that ancient sources recorded with a mixture of horror and prurient fascination. Pliny the Elder, in his Encyclopedic Natural History, a work primarily concerned with botany, zoology, and mineralogy, included a detail that seemed to obsess him: a competition between the Empress Messalina and a famous prostitute named Scylla. The challenge was endurance: who could sustain sexual activity with more partners in a single night. The prostitute completed 25 encounters. Messalina won with 25 plus 1. Pliny writes about this with the clinical precision he usually reserves for describing unusual plants or rare minerals. He doesn't editorialize. He presents it as a documented fact, extraordinary but verified. Whether the event literally occurred as described is impossible to prove. What matters is that Pliny, writing from sources now lost, believed it credible enough to include in a work meant to catalog the natural world. The story captured something Romans were witnessing but couldn't articulate: a woman wielding sexual power, not as submission, but as conquest, as demonstration of dominance. The traditional Roman framework divided women into 2 categories: the chaste matrona, who embodied family honor, and the meretrix, who sold her body. Messalina somehow occupied both categories simultaneously, violating the fundamental binary that Roman sexual morality required. The case of Gaius Appius Silanus illustrates how Messalina's system escalated from control to elimination. Silanus was a distinguished senator, consul in 28 CE, military commander with a reputation for competence and integrity, exactly the kind of respected figure whose endorsement Claudius valued. Around 42 CE, Messalina approached him with an invitation. Sources don't specify what she demanded, only that Silanus refused. For a woman who'd built her power on compelled participation, refusal was intolerable. She couldn't simply have him murdered. Silanus was too prominent, too respected. Instead, she constructed a trap. She convinced Narcissus, Claudius's freedman secretary, to report that he'd experienced an ominous dream. Silanus would attack the emperor. In a culture where dreams were considered divine communication, this carried weight. Then Messalina reported the same dream independently. Finally, when Claudius mentioned these unsettling premonitions to Silanus himself, the senator went pale. He'd experienced the same dream the previous night. The convergence seemed like divine warning rather than orchestrated theater. Claudius, genuinely frightened, ordered Silanus's execution. The senator was dead within hours, granted the mercy of suicide rather than public execution. Only afterward did palace insiders recognize the coordination. 3 people reporting the same dream wasn't divine prophecy. It was stagecraft. But by then, Silanus was ashes, and questioning the Empress's motives meant implicating the emperor in judicial murder. Silence was safer. The elimination of Silanus demonstrated a crucial escalation. Messalina was no longer merely collecting leverage. She was removing obstacles permanently. and she was doing it by manipulating the superstitions and fears of the emperor himself, turning Claudius into the instrument of her will, without his conscious knowledge. It was a technique she would employ repeatedly, and it revealed something about the nature of her power. It operated most effectively when its targets didn't realize they were being controlled. By 47 CE, Messalina's position seemed unassailable. She'd given the emperor heirs, maintained her public image as dutiful wife, and constructed a private network that controlled significant portions of Rome's political class through blackmail, complicity, and fear. Senators who attended her banquets couldn't move against her without exposing themselves. Palace freedmen who knew details of her activities were either complicit or terrified. And Claudius, who almost certainly understood on some level what was happening, was trapped by the same logic that imprisoned everyone else. Public acknowledgement of his wife's behavior meant admitting he'd been cuckolded before the entire empire, proving every critic right about his weakness. Then she made the decision that would destroy everything. She decided to remarry while still empress. Gaius Silius was consul designate for 48 CE, one of Rome's highest offices. Young, aristocratic, handsome, ambitious, everything Claudius was not. He'd been part of Messalina's circle for years, but in early 48 CE, their relationship changed. Sources disagree on who initiated the idea and what exactly they intended. Tacitus suggests Silius saw an opportunity to become emperor through marriage to Claudius's wife. Cassius Dio implies Messalina was bored with manipulation and wanted the thrill of open transgression. Suetonius hints at a genuine emotional connection, rare in a world where aristocratic marriages were political transactions. In 48 CE, while Emperor Claudius worked in Ostia, Messalina committed a stunning act of defiance. She publicly married Gaius Silius without divorcing the emperor. The ceremony included witnesses, legal contracts, and religious rites, carried out as if she were free to choose another husband. Roman law forbade bigamy, and her decision shocked even those who had tolerated her earlier schemes. Narcissus, Claudius's trusted freedman, received reports of the wedding and rushed to the emperor with witnesses and a signed contract. Claudius, shaken and fearful of political threat, returned to Rome with the Praetorian Guard. Silius was arrested at once, and Messalina escaped to the gardens of Lucullus, unable to accept that her influence had collapsed. When soldiers arrived, she attempted to write plea for mercy, but could barely form clear words. She tried to end her own life but failed, and a tribune delivered the fatal blow. She died at about 25. The Senate swiftly imposed damnatio memoria. Her statues were destroyed, her name erased from inscriptions, and her image removed from public spaces. Her children suffered afterward. Octavia was forced to marry Nero and later executed, while Britannicus was poisoned at 14. Silius and several supporters were also killed for their involvement. Rome's attempt to erase her ultimately failed. Historians preserved her story, though often reshaped by political agendas. Behind the accusations lies a harsher truth. Messalina lived inside an empire built on power, fear, and hypocrisy.